Welcome to Intergenerational Politics, a podcast that makes politics engaging and relevant for all generations. This is Victor Shi, a freshman at UCLA, the youngest elected delegate for Joe Biden, and also one of the co-hosts of this podcast.
And I'm Jill Wine-Banks, his co-host and the author of The Watergate Girl, as well as being a former Watergate special prosecutor. I'm also the wearer of Jill's pins, which today honor. It is a zombie, and that's because that is part of the name of his newest book. With each day that passes, it is becoming more apparent that the goal of Republicans isn't to represent the American people or even all Republican voters, but instead just to stay in power and to represent the loudest, most conservative members of their primary voters. A case in point is what we just saw about the passage of a $1.9 trillion COVID relief package with no Republican support, despite the fact that 75% of all Americans, including Republicans, support this bill. This raises multiple questions that we hope to discuss with our guests today and try to find out what we can do to communicate why they are doing this despite the best interests of their constituents and why they care little about facts and truth.
That also raises how we get individuals to understand facts and economics and the media's role in communicating facts. These are questions that no one better can answer than our guest today, Paul Krugman, famed economist, New York Times columnist, Nobel Prize winner in economics, and author of a book Jill and I found fascinating, Arguing with Zombies, Economics, Politics, and a Fight for a Better Future. Paul has written or edited 27 books and more than 200 papers in professional journals. He has also founded the New Trade Theory, a major rethinking of international trade. He has a Ph.D. from MIT and has taught at Yale, MIT, Stanford, and is currently a Professor Emeritus at Princeton's Woodrow Wilson School and a distinguished professor at City University of New York. Thank you so much for being here, Paul. It's an honor, and we are looking forward to this conversation.
Okay, well, it should be fun. Safe inside, safe from the zombies.
Yeah. Let's start with talking about zombies. And as a novice author, I'm always interested how experienced authors like you approach writing. And in this case, your book is a collection of essays that you wrote for the New York Times and other publications that you somehow seamlessly wove into a book that conveys an underlying theme about our current political climate, particularly the economic issues. So how did you come to write the book in that way as a collection of essays, and how easy or hard was it for you to find essays from your past that would support the point you wanted to make?
Yeah, I wrote it this way, I think partly because it's a little bit easier to put together a book that collects a lot of past material, though there is some new material, than it is to write from a standing start, but also because I think having these essays as they were written in real time over the course of about 15 years, they, as various individual issues came and went, gives you a little bit more, I think, a little more of a sense of what it was like to try and contend with stuff as it was happening or as it was trying to go wrong. The thing is, what I do for in my journalistic second career is not pound the pavement reporting. I'm not cultivating insider sources. I'm trying to do issues, and I am constantly pursuing a set of issues that all relate some way to things I hope I know something about. And the columns themselves, the individual articles, are actually thematic. They're usually, it's not that something came up in the news today and I'm just going to write about it because everybody's talking about it. I certainly am influenced by the news, but there's always a background set of themes that I'm working on, a lot of which turn out to fall under these categories of zombie ideas that won't go away. So it was not actually, there is this problem when you write 2 columns a week for 20 years. You forget a lot of what you've written in the past, but it wasn't that hard actually to just go through and find things that could be assembled into a coherent narrative.
Did you find in going through them that a lot of what you had written was what we would call evergreen, that it hadn't gone stale with the passage of time, and
Oh
that
yeah, yeah. I was going to say that's the thing is that the zombification of our politics helps because a lot of stuff is just frozen. I mean, what Republicans are saying about tax cuts and the horror of what will happen if you raise taxes now is indistinguishable from what they were saying 20 years ago. So a lot of these issues just come along now. Some of the background changes, but a lot of things are just there are not a whole lot of things I've written that just look hopelessly dated, at least over those past 20 years.
But even given that, I understand that you did reformat the book for I guess, the new edition, the paperback edition, that you added more about COVID. Is that correct?
Yeah.
And so was that because there was a change in policy or just in the context for the policies?
Actually, both. First of all, there was, in fact, something we may want to talk about is the way COVID has brought some pretty dramatic policy changes one way or another in ways that are beyond what I would have expected, I think. It was also about providing context, but also although it was not quite the thing, when I wrote about zombies, I wasn't expecting to actually live through the zombie apocalypse. But the fact that the nature of the way that we dealt or failed to deal with COVID-19 was very much in line with everything we've seen before. So, if you talked about people not being willing to accept inconvenient facts, if you wanted to talk about the attempt to squeeze everything into an ideological agenda, just watching watching the Trump administration trying to deny COVID. I mean, if you were accustomed to following climate change politics, climate denial, then COVID denial was very recognizably the same, pretty much the same thing.
So do you want to talk a little bit more about what you feel changed as a result of COVID in terms of economic policy?
Yeah. Let me say so for once, I've got a positive surprise. Obviously, we screwed up terribly, and there were several 100,000 people have died who didn't have to die, and so that in many ways it's been just horrific, and things that you really wouldn't have believed. I mean, even I don't think would have been cynical enough to think that wearing a mask would become a symbol of, or refusing to wear a mask would become an identity symbol that basically, kill people to prove that you're a real American. But the economic response was far better than I would have expected. It was a whole stop and go response, but we did in fact provide a lot of aid to people who were unemployed. We provide a lot of money to families. So even with Trump still in the White House, it was as if faced with a real crisis, the usual suspects kind of, in a way, they were just paralyzed. This just didn't fit any way that they knew how to do things. They effectively allowed the structure of the economic relief program to be dictated by reasonable people, mostly Democrats. And now we've just had this extraordinary, again, a COVID relief bill from Joe Biden and the razor thin Democratic majority in Congress, which is far more ambitious, more progressive than I would have thought we were going to get. So in a weird way, COVID has shown that there's still some possibility of doing the right thing.
I was going to ask later, but let's pursue, because you mentioned it now, is the 1.9 trillion has been viewed as way too big by the opponents, which means the Republicans. And they're warning that inflation will result because we're putting all this money out to people, they'll spend it, and therefore there'll be a shortage of goods. And as a result, of course, prices will rise because that's what happens when supply is diminished, prices go up. Um, do you think that that's what's going to happen? Do you think that this is the right number? Too big? Too
Okay.
small?
It's actually, this is actually a slightly more complicated question than one might want. Concerns that it's a lot of money going out there are not silly, and it's not just Republicans. There are, certainly perfectly reasonable Democratic-leaning economists who are a little nervous, and I wouldn't be surprised to see some inflation from this. The U.S. is a huge economy, has a lot of still unemployed workers, but still, 1.9 trillion here, 1.9 trillion there, and soon you're talking about real money, even for America. So this is a big thing. And if it had been designed, if the only goal were to provide economic stimulus, then this would be too big a number. You could get enough to get us back to full employment while spending less, and which does raise the question: are we, going to have some problems because we didn't, because we spent more? But it's not. This is a bill that is, it's actually it's using the economics of COVID. I mean, partly there are things we need to do. A lot of this is about, it's called the American Rescue Plan, and that's actually a good characterization. It's not a stimulus. It's about getting people through the still very, very difficult times created by the pandemic. So a lot of it is things like aid, like enhanced unemployment benefits, aid to state and local governments. There's things in there that are not the kinds of things economists would normally advocate, especially sending everybody a $1,400 check. That's justifiable in terms of the economics by the fact that not everybody is there are holes in the other things we're doing, and some of that money will make it to will refresh the parts that other policies can't reach. The saving grace, in a way, if you're worried about inflation, is that quite a few people are just going to save their $1,400 checks. We're not going to get as much excessive stimulus as you might have worried about otherwise. So I'm not sure that there's some magic, this calculation that would lead you to exactly this size bill. But if you take a look at it and you say, okay, which parts of it would you say you don't want to do? Do you not want to do those checks? Well, they will help some people who need help. We can afford them, and they're extremely popular. Democrats wouldn't control the Senate if they hadn't been able to campaign on those in Georgia. If we talk about unemployment benefits, really, do you really want to cut back on that at a time when we still have, when we're still 10 million jobs down from pre-pandemic, and so on down the line? So it's a reasonable bill. I think there's some chance that there's a pretty good chance that we'll see an uptick in inflation over the next year. The chance that it will become a more enduring problem is way less than that. And I have to say, I think a lot of economists and public people are still stuck in the 70s. It's bell-bottom pants and sustained inflation are both probably not coming back.
I certainly hope not for both of those.
Yeah, for sure. So your earliest contributions to economics weren't as a pundit, but rather as an academic and a professor. In fact, at the opening of your book, you write, punditry was never part of the plan, but then you end up in punditry. So I'm wondering what it was like for you to go from being a professor at, leading institutions of the world into the world of punditry.
Okay, I had, fortunately, it wasn't a sudden transition. It was, I started doing occasional writing for a somewhat broader audience as far back as the 80s. Started writing occasional things for, I was going to say, public journals like Foreign Affairs, which obviously Foreign Affairs wouldn't seem to most people like, kind of slumming it, but it's but relative to the abstruseness of economics journals, it is kind of. I was writing columns for Slate and for Fortune for some years, so I sort of got into this. But when it becomes a large part of your job, then you really need to learn to think about how it is that you communicate with people who are intelligent but not specialists. And I think some of my earliest columns really were, I was trying to pack too much in. But and of course the big question you would ask as well. You're a professor, and now you're entering the world of journalism where people are expected to write fast, and how am I going to handle on that? And I was always a fast writer as an academic. The question was, well, how would I stack up in this new world? And the answer was, to my shock, turns out I'm fast by journalist standards as well. So I can handle it, at least in terms of the mechanics of the process.
Right, and that's, I think, explains a lot about your, not only your high quality work, but the number of columns that you put out now on a weekly basis for the New York Times. And part of this transition, I'm wondering, was the switch from I guess the transition from academia into more kind of opinion columnist, was that kind of a decision because you wanted to communicate and influence more people or educate the public on some of what's going on? Like, what was the reasoning behind you going into writing these pieces for the better known publications?
It was partly that I felt that I wanted to communicate more broadly, and a lot of it was I was hoping to reach more than the academic literature can, not which is not at all to denigrate. Obviously, it's my home was doing academic research, and let's be honest. There is a bit of a life cycle issue. If you're if you what you do is research, and particularly if what you do tends to be largely theoretical research, which I was always trying to respond to facts about the world, but was my contribution in my pre-journalistic days tended to be models that made that typically mathematical models that made sense of what we were seeing. You get if you keep on doing that your entire life and nothing else, then I think you do tend to get stale. You tend to the ruts in your brain get too deep, and so it's a good idea in general to do something different. As it turned out, writing for a broader audience was something that the opportunity came along. I enjoyed it. I felt I was doing some good. And so there we are.
You definitely did. And all of those essays are compiled into your book, Arguing with Zombies. And that got my attention, the title of your book. But, for someone who may be scanning a book online or in a bookstore when they were open, and when hopefully we can go back to bookstores when it's safe, it might strike as a sci-fi book. But to be clear, you have explained the concepts of zombies as ideas and policies that should have been killed by contrary evidence, but instead keep shambling along, eating people's brains. Was this something that you noticed while you were a professor, or was this something that you started to pick up once you became a thoughtful and thought-provoking columnist?
Okay, it's very much an ongoing evolution. It becomes much more obvious once you're writing for the broader audience and you start to have a better sense of what's actually driving policy. But long before, the oldest essay in Arguing with Zombies is an essay I wrote for the American Prospect on income inequality in 1992. So that was a venture into more policy, political writing. And even then, it was obvious that the people who were denying that inequality was rising or insisting that it did no harm were trotting out repeatedly arguments that were provably wrong. But that didn't stop them from coming out. And one of the things is that's a 1992 essay, and it hasn't dated much because the same zombie arguments are still being deployed on the subject of inequality today. So if you're at all engaged with public policy, you can't help but notice that an awful lot of the discussion of the arguments about public policy are not zombie arguments. They are things that it's not that there are really two sides, or it's not that there's really a case that is grounded in anything except prejudice for a lot of these ideas. They just are ideas that keep shambling along because they serve some purpose.
And your description of zombies aptly illustrates many of the ideas, or maybe the lack of ideas, coming from elected officials. And it seems like you were suggesting that the zombie ideas came before Trump. But to me, the first thing that comes to my mind is Newt Gingrich's kind of contract with America, which totally ignored economics and then led to the decline of a sane, fact-based Republican Party. Does it go further than that, this idea of zombie ideas?
Oh, sure. In fact, that essay about inequality was actually responding to nonsense arguments from officials in the elder Bush administration who were trying to deny that inequality was rising, even though it clearly was. There was an awful lot of zombie stuff already in the Reagan years, and so it's not new, but it's gotten more intense. In 1992, you could still have a discussion. We could do something. There were a lot of bad ideas floating around in the Bush 1 administration, but there were also serious environmental policies that curbed acid rain. By the late 1990s, you already have a lot of Newt Gingrich type craziness in the Republican Party. By the George W. Bush, it's just, one of the magic talents of the modern GOP is that each successive Republican president manages to make his predecessor look good. But so it has intensified, but it really does go back. You really should, if you were actually watching discussions during the Reagan years, even then it was, how can people be saying this nonsense? It's just that the nonsense just gets more nonsensical over time.
Yeah, it seems to me that the ignorance of facts, truth, and even reality has been festering within the Republican Party for quite some time. And as a result of Trump, it attracted more people from the extreme edges, which explains a lot of the volume of conspiracy theories out there. Is this something that you also see on the Democratic side, or is this something that pretty much happens on the Republican side only?
There's some of this always. There are always going to be nonsense views. We could go. There are some issues where a lot of, I'm afraid, liberals get it wrong, like house zoning and housing affordability, and you can see that it's perfectly possible for bad ideas to take root and be hard to dislodge on the left as well as the right. I think the point is that in America in the 21st century, the power behind bad ideas is just vastly greater on the right. So, if we were in Venezuela, and I'm sure I would be finding plenty of really bad ideas coming from the left that had deleterious influence. In America in 2021, we just don't. There are those people. There are certainly some unreasonable people on the left, but they're not in power. It's kind of contemporary stuff, but you look at the people who are treated as being like the extreme left of the Democratic Party, like AOC, and she don't agree with everything she says, but she's not at all outlandish in her statements. The point is that there is no Democratic side counterpart to the crazies who actually are often dominant on the right.
Your book takes us through in a very clear way how conservatives have relentlessly misled and misguided the public on various economic policies and Social Security, Obamacare, tax cuts. Can you maybe give some more examples of how Republicans have done so? And I want to also relate it to something you said, which is, the nonsense keeps getting repeated over and over again. And how do we combat that? How can mainstream media like the New York Times communicate to the people who are listening to Fox News so that people understand that what they're hearing is nonsense?
Okay, so there are different. There's multiple questions in there. So one, there are probably the most, in terms of the U.S. political scene, the most persistent zombie idea that continues to warp politics is just the belief in the magic of tax cuts. That's kind of in terms of the political scene, that's the zombie supreme of American politics. In terms of what's the most frightening zombie, it's climate denial. The systems for climate is not changing, or it's not changing because of human intervention, or there's nothing we can do about it, or and that's a existential threat, a zombie idea. I'm not sure whether you can actually reach hardcore Fox News viewers or worse, QAnon theorists. I don't know how to do that. I'm not sure anyone does. But where you can make a difference is on people who are not fully sunk in that, and particularly people who haven't grasped the difference between the zombie ideas and real arguments. And the news media are a very important part of getting this right. Again, not Fox, which is not in the business of conveying information, but something like the New York Times or the Washington Post or CNN. They can actually try to do the job of not. It's easy and seems safe to say, Republicans say this and Democrats say that, and instead to go and let's talk about what reality is. That can help a lot.
So you make a lot of things very clear in very plain English, very readable in your book, but one of them is about Republicans really caring more about serving corporations and the top 1% and not caring about the poor and the fact that their policies hurt the poor, despite the fact that they keep saying they're for working families. And Bernie Sanders, of course, and many other progressives, AOC, have echoed this, and it certainly resonates with Victor's generation. Republicans argue that it isn't true, and they assert that they are for the working class. And I would like to find out from you, is there any truth to the Republican argument that they are for the working class? Do they care at all about that group of people? Is any of their policies helping the people who are voting for them on that premise?
Yeah, the answer is no. There's no truth to that claim, and it's a bit of a mystery. You mentioned it, I think, at the beginning. The Biden administration has enacted a big relief plan, which is extremely popular. Even majority of Republicans approve of it, but it didn't get a single Republican vote in Congress. There are some developments at the state level. I mean, the state of Missouri, they had a referendum on expanding Medicaid, which is almost free because under Obamacare, the federal government picks up the great bulk of the cost. And the public in Missouri voted for it. And the Republican legislature has refused to provide funds for this thing, which is actually, it looks like there's going to be a real problem with the Missouri state constitution. But in any case, the fact is that here's something, and Medicaid is something that a lot of people on Medicaid are working class. Most people on Medicaid are working, in fact, and a lot of people who are currently working and have some kind of health insurance are always at risk, and so they might need Medicaid. And so this is a working class policy, which happens to have overwhelming public approval. So they really are not willing to do this at all. Now, what I have to say is that there's a puzzle. 15 years ago, it was very clear what was happening with the Republican Party. It was a party that was effectively controlled by a group of wealthy donors and corporations, and it served their interests. But what it did was to win elections by appealing to cultural issues, racial hostility. So it was kind of reaching out. It had this kind of populism of the emotions while actually doing elitism of the policy. The Republican establishment has now lost control. The monsters it summoned up have taken over the party. It's all. It's no longer the case that there's an inner circle of billionaire finance people who really get to control stuff, and instead everybody is bowing at the altar of Trumpism. but they haven't actually moved at all towards genuine populist economic policies. It's a little bit of a puzzle why they won't do that, and I'm trying to figure it out. But it is interesting that I mean the Alma, the great read, although the analysis, I'm told, by political scientists was a little bit flaky. But What's the Matter with Kansas by Tom Frank, about the winning elections by being against gay marriage, or ultimately a lot about race, but then immediately turning after the election to policies that are all about enriching the already rich. That's not a good model of the party anymore, because the bigots, if you like, are now actually running the show, but the policies haven't changed much.
So, what are the best answers to Republican arguments? Is it just there's simply no support in economic research? How do we get that across to people?
Part of it is to just point to facts, to point to not just research, but simple historical facts. The governor of Kansas promised a miracle when he slashed taxes. Didn't happen. Instead, they ended up killing their education system. Part of it is, to the extent that people are influenced by national media, the national media can and sometimes does draw on the research, but it's not usually very abstruse research. It's pretty straightforward stuff. I think it's also, if I can say, I think there's a political issue here, which is one way to fight zombie ideas is to actually enact good popular policies that can win people over. So there was a problem, I would say, with Obama, which was, although fine individual and many good things to say about it, but his administration tended to look for subtle policy interventions. It was afraid of seeming to be too populist, to just giving people money, whereas given the political realities, you have to just do things that are really clear and are popular, and we'll see whether that works. But that seems to be what's happening now.
Progressives have been calling on that very point that you just made. Progressives have been calling on moderate Democrats and even Biden to play hardball and to eliminate the filibuster, stop fooling themselves that they can work with Republicans and move more left on their economic policies, which you say in your book is something that the public is on board with, that tougher strategy than many elected Democrats are. Do you think that this argument from progressives has moved the new administration? Do you think they should be more aggressive with how they're approaching things right now?
Well, they have actually turned out to be remarkably aggressive.
Yeah.
Again, the American Rescue Plan was a really big deal, and it's and much more progressive than anyone, I think, would have predicted if you told them a year earlier that Joe Biden would be the president. There is a problem. You do have Democrats who are still reluctant to go all the way, and on the filibuster, I think. Making the case for eliminating the filibuster is very good. Demanding it, unfortunately, I think an across-the-board elimination is not going to happen because you have no leeway. It just takes one Democratic senator who isn't willing to go along to stop it. I think that's unfortunately how tight things are. But you can, I think there's a pretty good chance of getting specific areas of voting rights, saying that we're not going to allow the filibuster to block guarantees of voting rights. And one of the things, how are we passing these big bills without them being filibustered? And the answer is, well, there is a procedure, reconciliation, that lets you do that on fiscal matters only, so not everything can be covered by it. But that was available to Obama as well. He could have done his stimulus with reconciliation, but chose not to because they thought they needed to try and build bipartisan support. And basically, what's happened is that even though the Democratic majority is much smaller than it was then, the party has learned something. And so I don't know, how it actually ends up working out. But what people are talking a little bit about the Manchin cycle, where he says, "Oh, I don't think we should do something without bipartisan support. I appeal to my Republican colleagues to join us in doing this." And then step by step, he ends up voting for the Democratic agenda. So and that's okay if that's what it takes. I mean.
Just messes with our brain even more. But I mean, this idea of bipartisanship is something that's appealing to me, and something that Biden clearly wants to run on and advocate. But I'm wondering, just from an economic view, when should bipartisanship be forsaken? And do you think that Democrats should even work with Republicans when they won't even acknowledge reality and they continue to spew lies?
Yeah. So you don't. I mean, bipartisanship. I've never bought the idea that bipartisanship, in and of itself, has a value. I mean, there's something to be said for not ramming through policies that are that have a very narrow base of support. But if you have a situation like the one we have now, where there are policies that actually have quite broad support among the public, but can't get any Republican votes, then you should just do them. There's the idea that we should be giving a political party veto power when it doesn't actually have the public behind it, and constitutionally doesn't have that power, then I don't see why you would want to do that. And it certainly helps in a way. It helps the case that for being aggressive, that we aren't seeing any good faith outreach. I mean, if it's a funny thing, actually, if Republican moderates, there aren't any really, but those who have a moderate affect, had proposed a relief package that was inadequate, but not grossly inadequate, they might have actually managed to force Biden into something much more much more cautious than what he actually did. But the complete intransigence said, okay, but even the most moderate Democrats to say, well, the heck with this. We're not going to compromise on the basics.
It's definitely a problem. And, Abraham Lincoln famously said, public sentiment is everything. And it seems like, I don't know, like public pressure. Do you think that's even a possibility now with Republicans? Like we always say, Jill and I, we've made it a constant point to say, protest, make sure that you make your voice heard. But does that even resonate with Republicans these days?
Well, it's interest at the moment doesn't appear to be. I mean, at the moment, combination of, there's explicit deliberate gerrymandering, and there's also just an awful lot of sorting, geographic sorting. There's inner city, urban areas are solid Democrat, rural areas are solid Republican. There's some battleground in the suburbs, but most members of Congress don't face it. The only relevant challenge they face is the challenge of an internal primary. And then, so it's not clear that moving public opinion can get you that much on that front. And it's not, well, it's just not at all clear what, we'll see. I mean, there are, if you can create sufficiently extreme cases. One of the things that a lot of us think is that this child tax credit that's part of the American Rescue Plan, although it's set to expire after 2 years, that even Republicans might balk at saying to every family with 2 kids, okay, we're going to cut your income by $6,000. So, and definitely make it heard, because among other things, don't want to allow the news media to create to believe that there's consensus on things that there aren't consensus on. So I think it really is important. I think, and you do move you move the window of what's possible by making your voice heard.
As someone who remembers bipartisanship and compromise, and hearing that as a positive rather than compromise is terrible, it does trouble me that we've gotten to where we are. But I want to go back to something that I found fascinating about your book, is something that you've said about how you approach commentary, which is, you said, stay with the easy stuff, write in English, and be honest about the dishonesty, and don't be afraid to talk about motives. And I thought that was interesting. It's so hard to communicate to the public, particularly on complex economic or legal issues, but you seem to have found a way to communicate so that people can understand these complex ideas. Can you explain more about what you meant about those steps to doing that?
So first of all, let's stick with the easy stuff. There are some really interesting, there are some interesting disputes in monetary policy, which is an area that I've worked on, among other things, over the years, and about the effectiveness of quantitative easing. I don't think I'm ever going to write a column about that, about quantitative easing, right? Because nobody knows what it's about. And in fact, the fact that it is a serious dispute is an indication that it's hard, it's technical. And actually, there was I really liked that there was a line, didn't like everything about it, but the Washington Post had an editorial about some of these disputes about whether the package is too big. And they said, the public can't be expected to adjudicate this dispute, right? This is you can get Larry Summers and me debating in a seminar, online seminar, fine. But to expect then people to be able to tell, really, that, okay, so and what you don't want to argue these things out on the op-ed page. It's simply because that's placing unreasonable expectations. But there's plenty of things that are perfectly straightforward, like, hey, we can cut child poverty in half quite easily. That's something that you should be doing. So stay with the easy stuff. Writing in English, yeah. And when I learned a little bit of the craft here, and early on, I think I did a fair number of columns where I would introduce a term and try to define it, and that's very rarely a good idea. Just explain what you're talking about, right? Just go to it. Don't use technical language, because it's technical language is a shorthand for people who are going to be spending a lot of time within a field. But just explain what you're talking about. And writing in English is hard. I know quite a few people in the economics profession who are good writers in their domain, who have written some really terrible op-eds because they just haven't figured out how to communicate with people who don't have them, who didn't go through 4 years of graduate school. Then the other two are where you get really, I think, more controversial. Should I simply say Paul Ryan's budget plans are a really bad idea, or should I say that he's faking it? And I think that you're not being fair to your readers if you don't convey the reality when someone. By the way, it's important also not to do that when you simply disagree. Yeah. So I may disagree about some things involving fiscal policy or housing policy, but I try to make a distinction between people who I regard as a flim-flam man, like someone like Paul Ryan, or someone who I think I just disagree with, currently Larry Summers. But when it is just that the people are not being honest, then I think you want to say that. And then, of course, the question of why. Look, we're writing about political economy of the United States. It's not at all. Again, it's unfair to your readers not to talk about what's driving this. If you want to know why do people keep saying the tax cuts pay for themselves, if you don't use some version of the old Upton Sinclair line, it's difficult to get a man to understand something when his salary depends on his not understanding it. You're not being fair to your readers. Of course, these things are kept alive because it's in the interests of some people to keep them alive.
Do you identify with a particular political party?
Well, strictly speaking, I'm not allowed to. The Times rules prohibit explicit endorsements of candidates, which is actually for a reason. That's so that you don't have, John Smith of the New York Times in an op-ed column says vote for candidate for Congressman Baumfog, and then people say the New York Times has endorsed Congressman. So endorsements are a prerogative of the paper, and not you have to steer clear of being that explicit. I mean, it's obvious where I am politically is center left. I'm a social democrat, as the Europeans would say. I think that there's a lot to be said for a market economy, but there's also a lot to be said for a very strong safety net and for a lot of policies of regulation, policies to mitigate inequality, and so on. Now, as it turns out, the U.S. Democratic Party, much more so than it was even than when Bill Clinton was president, the U.S. Democratic Party now is effectively a social democratic party. It's not that different from in terms of its goals, its orientation from European center-left parties. And of course, that political space is where I'm comfortable.
Thank you. So let's go back to this idea of people you disagree with. I know when I go on MSNBC that I am talking to minded people, to people who are going to be inclined to agree with me. And the same is probably true for you when you're writing for the New York Times. It's people who are more inclined to agree with your point of view. What I'm concerned about is how to engage in productive conversations with people on the other side, people who are watching Fox News and reading Breitbart. And I know you've already said there isn't really a good answer to how to do this, but the media is, to me, the fundamental bulwark of democracy. And in the marketplace of ideas, supposedly truth emerges. So how big a role do you think the media has in affecting perceptions of economic policy and political reality? And how can we encourage people to read both sides of a story?
Well, okay, lots of people are not going to be reachable. That's just reality. If there's someone who gets their whole news diet from Fox, then I don't know any way to reach across that divide. There are people who will respond to some degree to a real argument, and the thing to do is to I think to be inclusionary when you can. Don't say everybody who disagrees with me is evil, because that's not true. Only some of the people who disagree with me are evil, and to particularly there are times that the media can have an enormous impact because there is this middle ground, and sometimes that's for good, and sometimes it's for bad. I mean, one of the areas I talk about in Argument with Zombies, one of the whole there's a whole subsection of the book called Very Serious People, which is about that period in the early 2010s when an obsession with the budget deficit was, to an unfortunate degree, was bipartisan. It was people on both sides were saying it because everybody in the media was saying it. It was just reported as fact that we had a serious deficit problem, even though the evidence did not support that assertion at all. So this was a case of the media creating a false consensus that actually did substantial damage. So you can try to fight against that. You can try to make sure that we don't report as fact things that are not true. And yeah, occasionally there are forms of argument I don't like much. The old you said this, but now you said that. The fact that if somebody having said different things at different times in their career, that's often unproductive, but it is sometimes useful. Hypocrisy, pointing out hypocrisy, does seem to have some impact on voters, saying, "Look, this candidate who now says that the deficit is an existential threat under Biden didn't seem to care about deficit at all under Trump." That's the kind of thing that can matter.
A lot of what you've been saying throughout this conversation has been so useful for, I know will be so useful for my generation in terms of just how to write, how to communicate. And as a student, what I've noticed is that there sometimes isn't enough cultivation of critical thinking in the classroom. And that is, teachers kind of feed us information, we take a test, and then that's kind of the end of the learning process for whatever class it may be. Do you have any thoughts on teaching my generation in general and how to teach people to think critically?
Oh, wow. I mean, I don't have any deep insights into that. I mean, um, it's interesting. I do think that one thing I may be wrong about this, but it may be self-serving, but I think it would be helpful if students were required on occasion to do something like what I do in my day job here, which is to write a 800-word essay about a real issue and try to get your arms around it. It's state it in plain English. Don't rely on assertions of authority. Just how do you convey something like that? I think that we probably I'm not sure exactly how we're doing it at this point, but I think we probably are still too much. I understand the temptation, but we still do have too much. There's specific things that you need to be tested on, and of course, that's not totally irrelevant. But I don't know if you guys know this, but I'm a co-author of an economics textbook, principles book, which is where I believe we're number 3 in the national market. But anyway, and there are parts of that book that we've been the first edition was 15 years ago, that I spent always has said, do we really need to go through all of this stuff about elasticity? And the answer is, well, unfortunately, instructors want to do that. That's a kind of set piece thing they do. They devote a class to elasticity, and we got to. And at one level, having taught classes myself, I haven't done principles for a while, but yeah, I understand that. But on the other hand, yeah, we still have there's a fair bit of stuff in the teaching of certainly of economics that's kind of like the required figures in Olympic figure skating. Yeah, so you might be too young for that, but anyway, the stuff that I guess I understand why it's there, but boy, the audience finds it incredibly boring. So
Victor's actually a skater. So
I used to be a skater. But I do remember. Yeah, I do understand when I'm one of those people who understands what you're talking about when you say that. And I think the idea of writing an 800-word column, every now and then is definitely a good idea and something I've been trying to do lately. And it's it's a good exercise, and it's something that we write essays for professors. We do these multiple choice tests, but there isn't much, I don't know, like self self planning with these essays and kind of forming your ideas. And it's I think your idea would definitely be beneficial in the classroom. And I know you've also taught a master class, and it's something that I've watched, and the ads for master class are riveting, so it definitely pulls you in. But what was your experience like doing that? Was the reason why you agreed to do that to kind of convey economics in a more simple way?
Well, okay. So the first thing is that masterclass had already done a bunch, and I saw that some of the people who've been doing it, I sort of said, well, if it's good enough for Helen Mirren, it's good enough for me, right? So I thought I could have some fun and hopefully convey stuff in an interesting fashion, and it was I thought I enjoyed doing it, although it was pretty intense. And I actually also a little bit of a different experience, right? My life is normally spent in messy offices, so you go off, and of course what looks like this very cozy bookish space was actually a couple of bookshelves set up in a corner of a warehouse in Brooklyn. But the um, the experience was good, and they did it well. I mean, they had it. It was actually done as a dialogue, but then mostly edited so that it was only my voice. And so that actually worked. I don't know. It's just trying something different, and it seems to have. It's obviously I've been surprised at how many people have seen it. So trying something different, and it we're all searching, particularly in this new world of maybe not new for you, but still, this world of streaming and all of that. We're still trying to find out ways of communicating, and not we're still trying to figure out what the effective ways of teaching, communicating are, because a lot of traditional education is still, so it's still following structures that date back to the Middle Ages, and there have to be at least some things we want to do differently.
I totally agree. One last question to end the podcast. Are you optimistic about the future? Do you think that we can get rid of the zombies that you're talking about?
Oh, well, you never get rid of the zombies. That's sort of in their nature. You can only hope to diminish their influence. The truth is, I am I'm on a knife edge about the future. I'm both hopeful and terrified. There's a clear chance that we fall off the edge into an abyss. I mean, we've had a mob storm the Capitol. But there's also a clear possibility that we're really making a turn towards a fairer, more equitable, more rational set of policies, and a politics that is less about grievance and more about actually doing good things. And it kind of depends on how I'm feeling on a given more. I mean, the truth is, I'm always extremely hopeful and terrified at the same time. This is it's a cliche that we live in a time of transition and choice and change, but the truth is that it's real this time. The one thing I think seems extremely unlikely is that we'll just sort of coast along as we are now. We're either going to fall off one edge into the abyss, or we're going to get into a much better place. And I'm just hoping that it goes the right way.
This was a wonderful conversation. And Jill, I don't know if you want to wrap up the conversation.
I just want to say thank you for all you do, not just in being with us today, but all the insights that you offer every week to anyone who's willing to sit down and read really thoughtful words. We appreciate all you do, and thank you for spending the time with us.
Well, thank you. Good luck.
Thank you so much.